If you ever find a cottage with every window open but one door forever locked, walk away, the old mail carrier whispered, his weathered eyes fixed on the lonely cabin hidden beyond the towering pines. Most people laughed at the warning. They called it another mountain legend meant to keep curious hikers from wandering too far into the forest. But every sunrise, when the mist drifted across the narrow trail like pale ribbons, someone always noticed the same quiet figure stepping onto the porch with a basket in her hands. Claire Bennett had lived in that cottage for 6 years, though almost no one in Blackridge remembered the young Omega who had once been mocked, rejected, and quietly erased from their world. They remembered the shame. They remembered the whispers. They remembered the day the Alpha King looked past her as though she had never existed. What they forgot was how impossible it was for someone with nowhere to go to simply disappear. Claire never asked for visitors. She traded homemade preserves at the small town market once a month, smiled politely when spoken to, and returned home before sunset every single time. The children liked her because injured birds somehow flew again after she held them for a while, and frightened stray dogs always stopped trembling when she knelt beside them. The adults called it coincidence. Claire called it kindness. Yet every evening, precisely as the old grandfather clock inside her cottage chimed 8 times, she locked every window, pulled the curtains shut, and carried an old brass lantern down the narrow hallway toward the only door that never opened for anyone else. She would rest her hand against its faded white paint, close her eyes, and whisper words no one could hear before turning the key twice. Then silence swallowed the cottage until morning. Across the kingdom, another mystery was quietly unfolding. Alpha King Adrian Blackwood had begun receiving reports that made no sense. Royal scouts searching for the source of an ancient disturbance deep within the northern forest always returned with the same impossible observation. Strange lights appeared near an abandoned trail, vanished before dawn, and left behind no footprints except those belonging to a single woman. Adrian dismissed the first report, then the second. By the fifth, even his most trusted advisors stopped offering explanations. The lights appeared only near Claire's cottage. No one knew why. No one dared investigate after dark. The king had faced storms, political unrest, and impossible decisions without hesitation. Yet something about the simple sketch of that lonely cottage resting on his desk unsettled him in a way he could not explain. There was another detail hidden in the reports, one his advisors considered too insignificant to mention aloud. Every witness described the same sound drifting through the trees just before the mysterious lights disappeared. It wasn't a cry for help. It wasn't an animal. It was the gentle melody of a woman humming a lullaby no one recognized anymore. Adrian stared at the drawing until the candles burned low, unaware that the forgotten Omega he once believed had nothing left to offer had spent years protecting a secret hidden behind one locked door, a secret that had already begun changing both of their destinies long before either of them realized the price waiting at the end of the trail. Morning arrived with a gentle layer of silver fog rolling between the pines, softening every edge of the forest as though the mountain wished to hide its oldest memories. Claire Bennett stepped onto the porch carrying a small wooden bucket, her long brown hair tied loosely behind her neck as cool autumn air brushed against her pale skin. She greeted the day the same way she always had, watering the small herb garden beside the cottage before feeding the birds that had somehow learned to wait for her each sunrise. They landed without fear, hopping across the weathered railing while a timid white rabbit emerged from the bushes to nibble clover near her boots. Anyone watching from a distance would have believed she lived the simplest life imaginable. That illusion ended the moment she glanced toward the narrow hallway inside the cottage. Even from the porch, she could almost feel the silent presence waiting behind the locked door. She drew one slow breath before forcing herself to smile again, carefully closing the front door behind her as though nothing unusual existed within those old wooden walls. Nearly 50 miles away, Adrian Blackwood stood before an enormous map stretched across the council chamber. Colored pins marked every strange report his scouts had collected during the past month, yet all of them circled the same forgotten corner of the kingdom. His advisors debated ancient folklore, hidden smugglers, unusual weather, and abandoned ruins, but none of their theories explained why every mysterious trail disappeared beside Claire Bennett's property. Her name stirred something faint inside him, like hearing the final note of a forgotten song. He remembered a quiet Omega standing at the edge of a ceremonial gathering years ago, never demanding attention, never asking anyone to notice her. He also remembered making the easiest decision of his life by turning away before learning who she truly was. At the time, it had seemed practical. Now, for reasons he could not explain, the memory refused to leave him. By late afternoon, Adrian dismissed the council early and chose to travel without the usual royal escort. Only his oldest friend, Ethan Mercer, accompanied him on horseback as they followed a winding trail into the northern forest. The farther they traveled, the quieter the woods became. Even the wind seemed reluctant to disturb the towering trees. Ethan eventually broke the silence with a cautious smile. "Do you really believe one woman is responsible for all of this?" Adrian looked ahead without slowing his horse. "No, but I believe everyone ignored her for far too long." As evening settled over the mountains, the cottage finally appeared between the pines exactly as the reports had described, warm light glowing from every window except one. Claire stood outside hanging freshly washed blankets on a clothesline when she noticed two riders approaching through the fading sunlight. Her hands froze for the briefest moment before she composed herself. Years had changed Adrian's appearance very little. The calm authority in his silver eyes remained unmistakable. Their gazes met across the quiet yard, neither speaking as memories. Too heavy for simple greetings settled between them. Then, without warning, a faint sound echoed from somewhere deep inside the cottage. It was soft enough that Ethan failed to notice it, but Claire's face lost every trace of color. Before Adrian could ask what was wrong, she stepped directly between him and the front door with quiet determination and said, "Your Majesty, you may enter my home, but there is one room you must never ask to see." Claire stepped aside just enough to allow Adrian and Ethan into the cottage, but her eyes never left the narrow hallway at the back of the house. The interior smelled of cedarwood, fresh bread, and dried lavender hanging from the ceiling beams. Everything inside reflected a quiet life built with patient hands. Shelves held neatly labeled jars of herbs, stacks of well-read books rested beside a stone fireplace, and a worn rocking chair faced a window overlooking the forest. There was nothing remarkable about the home, yet Adrian immediately sensed something impossible to explain. It did not feel empty. It felt as though every object carried a memory too heavy to leave behind. Claire invited them to sit while she prepared tea, moving with calm precision that suggested routine rather than hospitality. Ethan admired the peaceful surroundings, commenting that the cottage was warmer than any royal guest house he had visited. Claire smiled politely, but offered little conversation. Adrian noticed the silence between her words instead of the words themselves. She listened constantly, her attention drifting toward the hallway every few moments before returning to the kettle simmering over the fire. The sound from earlier never came again, but the tension in her shoulders refused to disappear. When the tea was served, Adrian gently explained why he had come. Strange lights had been reported throughout the northern forest. Travelers claimed they vanished near this property. Royal Scouts had searched for answers without success. Claire lowered her eyes to the steaming cup in her hands. "The forest has protected many secrets longer than either of us has been alive," she answered softly. "Not every mystery wishes to be solved." Ethan exchanged a puzzled glance with Adrian, but neither challenged her. As twilight settled outside, a cool breeze slipped through the open kitchen window carrying the scent of pine needles and distant rain. Claire stood to close the window, and for the first time Adrian noticed a small silver key hanging from a simple chain beneath her sweater. She instinctively tucked it out of sight the moment she realized he had seen it. Before either of them could speak, a gentle chime echoed from somewhere deeper inside the cottage. It sounded delicate, almost musical, lasting only a few seconds before silence returned. Claire's expression changed instantly. She excused herself with quiet urgency and disappeared down the hallway, carefully closing the door behind her. Adrian remained seated, listening to faint footsteps beyond the wall. He could not make out any voices, only the soft creak of old wooden floors and the distant hum of what sounded like another lullaby. Minutes passed before Claire returned carrying an empty basket she clearly had not taken with her. She apologized for leaving so suddenly, claiming an old shelf had fallen in the storage room. Ethan accepted the explanation without question, but Adrian noticed there was not a trace of dust on her clothes or hands. Someone who had just cleaned a collapsed shelf would not look untouched. The realization settled quietly in his mind. Claire had lied, not to deceive for personal gain, but to protect whatever remained hidden beyond that hallway. As darkness wrapped itself around the cottage, Adrian stepped onto the porch and looked toward the forest. Tiny lights shimmered between the distant trees for only a heartbeat before fading into the night exactly as the reports had described. When he turned back toward the house, he caught Claire standing at the hallway entrance with one hand resting protectively over the hidden silver key. Her eyes filled not with fear for herself, but with fear that someone else might finally discover what she had spent years keeping safe. The following morning arrived beneath a pale gray sky that promised rain before sunset. Adrian woke earlier than usual, unable to explain why sleep had abandoned him long before dawn. Through the guest room window, he watched Claire standing alone near the edge of the forest, gathering wildflowers into a woven basket, while the rising sun painted soft gold across the clearing. There was a peaceful rhythm to every movement she made, yet even from a distance he sensed she was listening for something no one else could hear. When she returned to the cottage, she paused beside an old stone marker almost hidden beneath climbing ivy. She rested her fingertips against it for only a moment before continuing inside. Adrian quietly memorized its location. During breakfast, Claire remained warm but reserved, serving fresh bread, berry preserves, and herbal tea as though nothing unusual had happened the night before. Ethan complimented her cooking, earning a genuine smile that disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. Adrian noticed another detail instead. Every clock inside the cottage displayed exactly the same time. Every chair faced toward the hallway. Every evening lantern had already been filled with fresh oil, although daylight had barely begun. None of it appeared accidental. Everything seemed prepared for a routine that repeated every single day without fail. After breakfast, Ethan volunteered to inspect the nearby trails while Adrian offered to repair a loose fence near the garden. Claire hesitated before agreeing, though she remained close enough to keep the cottage within sight at all times. As Adrian worked, he found himself noticing small things that others would probably ignore. Fresh footprints circled the back of the house every morning, yet only one set ever returned. Tiny carved symbols marked several fence posts, almost invisible beneath years of weather. Wind chimes hanging beneath the porch roof never rang randomly. They seemed to answer one another in quiet patterns whenever the breeze shifted from the northern hills. Nothing frightened him. Instead, every discovery deepened his curiosity. Late that afternoon, clouds rolled across the mountains, bringing the first gentle drops of rain. Claire hurried outside to collect blankets from the clothesline, while Adrian carried empty flower pots beneath the porch roof. As thunder murmured somewhere beyond the valley, a sudden gust pushed open the front door. Both of them turned at the same instant. The hallway lay empty, but the locked white door at its end stood slightly open, no more than 2 inches. Claire froze. The color drained from her face as the basket slipped from her hands, scattering fresh herbs across the porch steps. She rushed inside with a speed Adrian had never seen before, gently pulling the door closed again before locking it with the silver key hidden beneath her sweater. She rested both hands against the weathered wood and closed her eyes until her breathing slowed. Adrian remained where he stood, respecting the boundary she had drawn, yet one detail lingered in his thoughts. During the brief moment the door had been open, he had seen no treasure, no hidden chamber, and no sign of danger. He had only caught a glimpse of warm candlelight reflecting against dozens of carefully framed drawings covering the far wall. Every frame appeared handmade. Every picture seemed protected with extraordinary care. When Claire finally returned, her eyes glistened with quiet emotion, but her voice remained steady. "Some memories survive only because someone chooses to guard them," she said softly. Adrian looked toward the closed hallway one last time, realizing that whatever waited behind that simple white door was not something she feared. It was someone, or something, she loved too deeply to let the rest of the world misunderstand. Rain lingered through the night, leaving the forest wrapped in the fresh scent of pine and damp earth when morning finally returned. Ethan departed at sunrise to report his findings to the Royal Council, promising to return within several days if Adrian required assistance. The Alpha King watched his friend disappear down the winding trail before turning back toward the quiet cottage. For the first time in years, he found himself in no hurry to return to the palace. Claire seemed relieved by the smaller company, though the invisible distance she kept between herself and the locked hallway never changed. The day unfolded with unexpected simplicity. Adrian repaired loose shutters that had weathered too many winters, while Claire worked beside the garden transplanting herbs into larger wooden boxes before the colder months arrived. They spoke little at first, yet the silence between them no longer felt uncomfortable. It carried the quiet familiarity of two people slowly remembering that trust was not built through grand promises, but through ordinary moments shared without expectation. Around midday, Adrian noticed an elderly neighbor approaching with a basket of apples balanced carefully against her hip. The woman greeted Claire with obvious affection, thanking her for sitting beside her husband during his long illness the previous winter when no one else had visited. After she left, another family stopped to deliver fresh honey in exchange for blankets Claire had sewn for their children. By early afternoon, a young shepherd appeared carrying flowers gathered from the hills simply because Claire had once helped rescue an injured lamb caught beneath a fallen branch. Adrian quietly watched each visitor leave with genuine gratitude reflected in their smiles. None of them treated Claire as the forgotten Omega he remembered from years ago. Here, beyond the reach of the royal court, she had quietly become the heart of an entire mountain community without asking anyone for recognition. The realization settled heavily inside him. How many lives had she touched while he remained completely unaware? As the afternoon sunlight filtered through the trees, Adrian finally asked the question that had lingered in his thoughts since arriving. "Why did you never return?" Claire continued trimming lavender stems before answering. "Return to what?" she asked gently. "To people who already decided who I was before they ever knew me?" Adrian lowered his eyes, unable to offer an honest reply. She was not accusing him. Somehow that made the truth even more difficult to carry. Claire smiled softly, though sadness lingered behind it like a distant memory that no longer demanded tears. "This forest never asked me to prove my worth," she said. "Neither did the people who live here. They simply accepted what kindness I could offer." A comfortable silence followed, until another faint chime drifted from somewhere beyond the hallway. Claire's expression changed almost imperceptibly. She stood, excused herself, and disappeared behind the familiar corner once again. This time Adrian remained exactly where he was, respecting the promise he had never spoken aloud. Several minutes later, she returned carrying a small wooden box decorated with tiny carved stars. She placed it carefully on the highest shelf above the fireplace before noticing Adrian watching. "It belonged to someone very important," she whispered. "I promised it would always stay safe." Adrian studied the worn edges of the little box, sensing another piece of a story she was still unwilling to tell. Outside, evening sunlight spilled across the cottage windows, but inside, he realized every answer he uncovered only revealed another deeper mystery. Whatever Claire protected was no longer simply hidden behind one locked door. It had quietly woven itself into every corner of her life, and for reasons he could not yet understand, he was beginning to fear that discovering the truth might also reveal the greatest mistake he had ever made. The answer arrived on the seventh evening almost by accident. A cold wind swept through the valley just before sunset, carrying dark clouds across the mountains far earlier than expected. Claire had gone outside to gather the last baskets of herbs before the rain arrived while Adrian secured the loose shutters against the growing storm. Everything felt strangely peaceful until the familiar wind chimes above the porch fell completely silent. Claire looked toward the forest with sudden concern, abandoning the baskets where they rested. "Please stay here," she said quietly before disappearing along a narrow path lined with ancient pine trees. Adrian wanted to honor her request, yet something in her voice carried a weight he had never heard before. He followed from a respectful distance, careful not to reveal himself. The trail ended at the old stone marker Claire had touched every morning. Kneeling beside it, she brushed away layers of moss until a weathered symbol carved into the rock became visible beneath the fading light. She removed the silver key from around her neck and pressed it gently into the center of the carving. A soft golden glow spread through the stone before disappearing as quietly as it had come. Claire closed her eyes and whispered, "Just a little longer." Adrian remained hidden behind the trees, his heart pounding not from fear, but from confusion. The stone was not opening a secret passage or revealing hidden treasure. It was responding to her as though recognizing someone who had faithfully returned every single day for years. Claire carefully replaced the key beneath her sweater before walking back toward the cottage, unaware she had been observed. That night heavy rain drummed against the roof, while thunder rolled across the distant hills. Long after midnight, Adrian woke to the faint melody he had heard before, the same gentle lullaby floating through the quiet hallway. Drawn by equal parts concern and curiosity, he stepped into the corridor. The locked white door stood slightly open once again. This time he did not enter. Instead, he remained in the shadows, unwilling to break the trust Claire had offered him. Through the narrow opening, he caught only fragments of the room beyond. Dozens of framed drawings covered the walls exactly as he remembered, each one showing the same places throughout the kingdom. Forests, villages, bridges, rivers, and finally the royal palace itself. Beneath every drawing rested handwritten notes dated year after year in Claire's careful handwriting. Before he could read another word, Claire gently pushed the door closed. She had known he was standing there all along. Instead of anger, sadness filled her eyes. "You were never meant to carry this burden," she whispered. Adrian looked at her in silence. "Then let me understand it." Claire lowered her gaze before walking to the fireplace. From the small wooden box carved with stars, she removed a faded leather journal and held it carefully in both hands. "Everything began the day you rejected me," she said softly. "Not because you were cruel, but because leaving the palace placed me on the path I was always meant to find. If I had stayed, none of what I have protected would still exist today." Adrian stared at the journal without touching it. At last he understood that the locked room had never been hiding Claire from the world. It had been protecting a truth so important that she had willingly surrendered her title, her future, and every chance of being understood simply to keep it alive. Adrian accepted the worn leather journal with both hands, almost afraid that even the smallest careless movement might damage something Claire had protected for so many years. The first page contained only a single sentence written in elegant handwriting. "Some promises are meant to be forgotten by history so that others may live without fear." As he turned the pages, every quiet mystery surrounding the cottage slowly unfolded into a truth far greater than he had imagined. There were maps marked with careful observations, lists of villages threatened by mysterious illnesses that had disappeared before reaching innocent families, records of damaged wells restored before entire communities ever realized they had been in danger, and detailed sketches of ancient stone markers hidden throughout the northern forests. Claire had traveled alone from one forgotten place to another for years, tending each marker according to instructions left by the guardians who came before her. The gentle lights reported by travelers had never been magic meant to frighten anyone. They appeared each time another ancient seal was quietly strengthened, preserving an invisible network that protected the kingdom from natural forces older than memory itself. If even one of those seals failed, storms, floods, and disease could spread across countless towns without warning. Adrian looked up in disbelief. Why did nobody know? Claire smiled with heartbreaking calm. Because they were never supposed to. She explained that generations earlier a small order of peaceful guardians had sworn never to seek recognition for their work. Each guardian chose one successor, passing along knowledge that could not be written openly or discussed before the royal court. Fame would have attracted ambitious people searching for power instead of responsibility. Secrecy was the only way the promise survived. When Claire had been rejected and left alone, an elderly guardian living near the mountains recognized a rare gift within her. It was not strength, wealth, or royal blood that qualified her. It was compassion. She listened before judging. She helped strangers without expecting reward. She remained kind after experiencing rejection herself. Those qualities made her the next guardian. Adrian closed the journal slowly, memories crashing together inside his mind. While the palace celebrated victories, Claire had quietly protected every road leading toward those celebrations. While nobles praised his leadership, she had preserved the forests feeding their villages. While history remembered kings, it would never remember the woman who ensured history could continue at all. Every invitation I declined, every festival I missed, every rumor I allowed people to believe kept this work hidden, Claire said softly. The loneliness became easier than explaining a truth no one was allowed to hear. Adrian finally understood why every neighbor respected her without knowing her full story. They had experienced the kindness born from her quiet calling without realizing its true purpose. His voice became almost a whisper. "You gave away your future." Claire looked toward the rain-speckled window where evening light shimmered across the trees. "No," she answered gently. "I simply chose a different one." Adrian felt a quiet ache settle deep within his heart. Years ago, he believed he had turned away from an unnoticed Omega. Now he realized he had walked away from the one person whose unseen devotion had protected his kingdom every single day, asking for nothing except the chance to continue serving in silence. And for the first time since arriving at the lonely cottage, he began to understand that the greatest loss in his life had happened long before he ever knew what he had lost. The days that followed passed with a quiet gentleness neither of them had expected. Adrian no longer searched for hidden answers inside the cottage because he finally understood that the greatest truths had never been concealed behind locked doors. They had been hidden inside the choices Claire made every single day without asking anyone to notice. He accompanied her along the forest paths as she visited ancient stone markers scattered across the mountains, carrying supplies while she carefully tended each forgotten place with the same patience she showed every living thing. She explained little, and he no longer pressed for explanations. Watching her work was enough. Every stone she touched, every faded symbol she quietly restored, every whispered promise she repeated had become part of a responsibility carried across generations by people whose names would never appear in history books. One crisp autumn afternoon, they reached the highest overlook in the valley where golden leaves drifted through the cool air. From there they could see villages stretching for miles below, smoke rising peacefully from distant chimneys as families prepared evening meals, completely unaware of the unseen protection surrounding them. Adrian stood beside Claire for a long time before finally breaking the silence. "All these years I believed I was protecting this kingdom," he said softly. "Now I know someone else carried that burden while I accepted the praise." Claire smiled gently without looking at him. "A kingdom survives because many people carry different burdens," she answered. "Some simply remain invisible." Her kindness hurt more than anger ever could have. She had every reason to blame him for the loneliness she endured, yet she never once spoke with bitterness. Instead, she offered understanding where he felt he deserved regret. That evening, after returning to the cottage, Adrian found Claire carefully packing several journals into a weathered leather satchel along with the carved wooden box, the silver key, and a folded map marked with dozens of familiar symbols. A quiet uneasiness settled over him. "Are you leaving?" he asked. Claire paused before nodding. "The time has come." She explained that every guardian eventually stepped aside so another could continue the work. A successor had finally been found in a distant village, someone who possessed the same quiet compassion that had once changed her own life. Before winter arrived, Claire intended to pass on everything she had protected, just as it had been entrusted to her years earlier. Adrian struggled to steady his voice. "Then come back with me afterward. Let the kingdom finally know what you have done." Claire looked at him with warmth touched by sadness. "If they know my story, they will begin searching for the next guardian. Curiosity would become expectation. Expectation would become ambition. The promise would not survive another generation." Adrian lowered his eyes because he knew she was right. The greatest gift she could leave behind was still her anonymity. Outside, the first stars appeared above the darkening forest while the familiar wind chimes answered the evening breeze with soft, clear notes. Adrian realized that time, not distance, had become his true enemy. He had finally found the woman he should have recognized years before, only to discover she was already preparing to walk another path beyond his reach. As Claire gently closed the satchel and rested her hand upon the worn leather journal one last time, Adrian silently made a promise of his own. Even if history could never speak her name, he would spend the rest of his life making certain the quiet world she had sacrificed everything to preserve would remain worthy of her extraordinary devotion. The morning Claire planned to leave arrived wrapped in quiet sunlight that filtered through the tall pines like strands of gold. The cottage looked exactly as it always had, peaceful and ordinary, as though it had never carried the weight of generations of forgotten promises. Claire stepped onto the porch with the worn leather satchel resting lightly against her shoulder. The silver key still hung around her neck, and the carved wooden box remained tucked safely inside her bag beside the journals that had shaped her entire adult life. Adrian stood waiting near the old stone path, unable to convince himself that this goodbye should happen without saying everything he had buried inside his heart for years. Before Claire could speak, he quietly removed the royal crest from his cloak and placed it upon the porch railing. For the first time since becoming Alpha King, he stood before her not as a ruler, but simply as Adrian. I cannot change the past, he said softly. I cannot erase the day I looked away or the years you carried this responsibility alone. But I can choose what kind of king I become because of what you have taught me. Claire looked at him with the same calm kindness that had guided every choice she had ever made. Then let people feel safe without ever needing to know why, she answered. That is how real service has always worked. Adrian nodded slowly, finally understanding that leadership was not measured by applause, but by the quiet lives protected when no one was watching. Together they walked one last time to the old stone marker overlooking the valley. The autumn wind carried the scent of pine through the mountains, while distant church bells echoed faintly from villages preparing for another peaceful day. Families laughed. Children chased one another through open fields. Smoke curled gently from cottage chimneys across the kingdom. None of them would ever know how close they had come to losing the unseen protection surrounding their homes, and none of them would ever know the woman who had preserved it with unwavering devotion. Claire knelt beside the weathered stone and carefully placed the silver key into the waiting hands of a young woman who had quietly arrived before sunrise. She was humble, gentle, and carried the same quiet compassion Claire had once shown a stranger many years before. No ceremony followed. No royal announcement echoed through the forest. The promise simply continued, just as it always had, passed from one faithful heart to another. As the new guardian disappeared among the trees, Claire stood and looked toward the cottage one final time. Adrian expected sadness, yet what he saw was peace. The locked room inside the little house no longer held a secret waiting to be discovered. Its purpose had been fulfilled. Claire reached for the weathered white door, opened it wide, and allowed warm morning light to flood every corner that had once remained hidden. The walls covered with carefully framed drawings no longer belonged to the past. They had become a quiet reminder that ordinary acts of kindness could protect an entire kingdom. Without ever asking for recognition, Adrian turned toward Claire, and this time there was nothing left unsaid between them. Side by side, they walked away from the cottage without looking back, leaving its front door open to the sunlight for the first time in many years. Travelers passing through the northern forest would still see the little house resting peacefully among the pines, but they would never know that the greatest treasure it had ever sheltered was not hidden behind a locked door. It was the gentle heart of a rejected Omega who proved that true strength never demanded to be seen, and whose quiet love forever transformed the king who had once failed to see her. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts, like, share, subscribe, enable notifications, and join us for more unforgettable alpha romance stories ahead.